Hello everyone and welcome back to the School of Taste. I am Nick Jackson. Great to be back with you for another session in our series Understanding Quality in Wine. If you're watching on recording, thank you very much for taking the time to do that. I appreciate it. And if you're watching live, as ever, please do use the questions function to submit any comments or questions during the course of the live webinar. So last week, we looked at the Burgundy region in the beginnings of our assessment of our understanding of how to look at and interpret and analyze quality in wines. And we tasted 3 different levels of quality in Burgundy. And I think we did see overall a movement up the quality hierarchy in accordance with what it should be. So when we tasted from the generic level, the Bourgogne level, to the village level, to the Premier Cru level, we did see an increase in quality, as you would expect. And we talked a little bit about how in Burgundy, the division between these sites is very tiny in a geographical sense. You can have a Grand Cru next to a Premier Cru next to a village wine. There can be only 500 meters between all 3 vineyards. That's the magic of Burgundy. But knowing that, the only reason then we can come up with that we can surmise for why these vineyards should give different qualities of wine, given how close they are, is because each have slightly different geographical qualities. Some particular aspect of each site differs from the next, which somehow results in differences in the final wine. So geographical differences, I was arguing last week, are, after the choice of grape variety, the element that is going to influence quality in the final wine most of all. So that's why I wanted to spend another session talking about geographical features, the site, the location where the grapes come from that make the wine, just because I think it's so important. But unlike last week when we were focusing on a very small, almost tiny area in some ways of one wine region, this week I want to explore a much bigger area. So we're going to look at wines that, even though they may be made from similar varieties, from the same country, from the same overall region, nonetheless, there can be very big differences in terms of geographically where they come from. To give you one example, in the first pair of wines that we'll taste in just a moment, the Côtes du Rhône appellation in France runs 125 miles from north to south, 185 kilometers. And we'll compare that to a Gigondas, which is just one village, just a few square kilometers. So a huge difference there. But without further ado, let's move on and set the scene for what we'll be discussing in this webinar. So the context for our discussion today is these, what I'm going to call more prestigious appellations like Barolo or Gigondas or Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which are famous, well-known individual villages, if you want to call them that, communes, appellations, but they're in a sea of other appellations, which make similar style wines, but usually not of the same quality. Now, it's not just me saying that, and you can test for yourself in just a moment. But if you look at the legal requirements governing each of these appellations, they are different. And that indicates that the authorities recognize at least the potential for making better wines from what I'm calling the prestigious appellations. So for instance, the wines of Barolo will have to be aged longer than the ones from Langhe. Importantly, they will also have to have lower yields, which is not something that we think about very often. But a key element in making concentrated wines is to have yields which are controlled. And then another aspect of it all is that often these outlying appellations, the bigger appellations surrounding the prestigious ones, will have different laws governing even the most basic things, like what varieties you can grow. In Barolo, of course, if you want to designate your wine with a Barolo DOCG, you have to make it out of 100% Nebbiolo. But in Langhe DOC, you can make white wine, rosé wine, red wine from all sorts of varieties. In a couple of cases, they're labeled, they're on the front of the label, the name of the variety, but the remit is much, much broader. So once again, I think that why isn't all of Langhe or all of Côtes du Rhône making wines at the equivalent level of the most prestigious appellations within them, I think is a question of geography, all the aspects that we touched on when it came to Burgundy, altitude, exposure, soil types, water availability, airflow, things like this, that give rise to people planting different varieties and making ultimately different style wines. So I guess what we'll look at today is whether indeed the authorities are correct to say that these outlying regions, these big regions, are making qualitatively inferior wines to the more prestigious regions within them, like Barolo. And second, and this is something that we didn't talk about last week, this is going to be a more of a focal point this week, is are there any other differences beyond just pure quality of the wines that we can assess from these outlying regions? Are we asking the right questions of those kind of wines if we compare them to the prestigious wines which they neighbor? That's going to be a kind of undercurrent of the discussion. So what I want to do first is taste the first pair of wines, the Côtes du Rhône and I said Gigondas, and hopefully you guys were able to find Gigondas. If you were able to find Vaccaras or Châteauneuf-du-Pape, totally fine as well, or even a village from the northern Rhône, totally fine. But let's taste those pair of wines together. And just to give you guys a bit more practice at this, I will go back to this slide that we were looking at last week, which is my sort of protocol, my methodology for how to assess quality in wines. And what I want you to do is not to give me the details wine by wine, but to make a comparison between the two wines as you taste them, and draw out the differences for me. Tell me this one is better or worse because it's got more or less of this feature, or it really lacks this. It's good at this, but it lacks this, and the other one is better at. So try and make a comparison between them. And another thing to think about, just as a reminder of what we were talking about last week, if you missed the session, I mentioned that the way that the first 7 bullet points on this slide, from aromatic expression to length, are qualities that you can assess in any wine, whether it costs $5 on a grocery supermarket shelf or whether it costs $500. But I was arguing that the bottom 5 bullet points, from age-worthiness to beauty, are only really relevant for more ambitious, more serious wines, wines of a different category from the ones that are on the bottom shelf in the supermarket. So one first question while you're making your comparison, and please look at all 7 factors at the top and think about which wine comes out on top in each one and which wine comes out on top overall. But one thing just to keep in the back of your mind is, do I need to assess these bottom 5 points for either or both wines? Or am I drinking a wine where really those bottom 5 points are not really that relevant? It might be a bit of a waste to spend the time thinking about those bottom 5 points. So that's going to take you, I know, a couple of minutes. So take your time to do the comparison between the Côtes du Rhône and the single village wine. But while you're doing that, I'll just give you a little reminder of these bullet points and what's to kind of look for in each one. The aromatic expression, frankly, 2 things. One, that you can actually smell something. I mean, aromas are a great feature of wine. It would be sad if you couldn't smell anything. And 2, that it's something that you want to smell, that it's a pleasant aroma. The very foundation of that, of course, is that the wine is not corked. That's what you can smell, and that's why you smell a wine before you taste it in a restaurant. So that it makes you want to taste the wine after you smelled it. So a good aromatic expression will want you will want to make you come back for more. Ripeness, the wine is not skinny, or it's not green or hard, or the tannins are bitter. The fruit is ripe and supple. The tannins are ripe. They might be firm, but they're not aggressive or abrasive. There's an overall sense that the wine is made in a vintage, in a style that allowed it to achieve the ripeness that comes naturally. I think complexity, as we talked about last week, kind of emerges out of ripeness. You have to have ripeness if you want complexity. That's a precondition. The complexity simply being, that there's multiple flavors going on at once. Can be fruit flavors, can be winemaking, can be tertiary flavors if there's some bottle age on your wine. But also think about things like minerality or any other aspects. Is there some herbal note or some spice or something perhaps unexpected? Complexity, how much is going on at once? Concentration or depth of fruit. I always assess that on the tongue, right in the middle of the tongue, because I think that's where you taste fruit. And for me, the concentration, the depth of fruit is really a question about whether it's just pure concentrated fruit or whether there's some kind of watery element to it. It's only like 50% fruit and the rest just kind of falls away. Do you put your tongue into it and just taste all fruit, or is it a bit watery, not really that concentrated? The best wines will be concentrated, so you want more concentration of fruit felt on the tongue. Balance, we talk about balance between different elements of the wine, but really the way I always think about it is there anything that sticks out from the wine that makes the wine not enjoyable or hard to drink for some reason? Is it too acidic or too tannic, or the alcohol is too high for the body weight? Think about those kind of things. If anything is out of balance, you'll know because it sticks out. And the way it sticks out means that the pleasure you have in tasting or drinking the wine is reduced somehow. When a wine's balanced, it just flows effortlessly over your tongue and you just want to keep on drinking. Intensity of flavor is when, if you have a very intensely flavored wine, the flavors just seem to fill all parts of your mouth. They just kind of reverberate in your mouth. Every inch of your palate is coated with flavor, and also on the finish. They carry on for a long time on the finish. And then finally in this list, the length, which continues from intensity of flavor, but not only do you continue to taste the wine for a long time in the best wines, but also that, like what you smell, it is something that you want to keep on tasting. It's not bitter tannin, or it's not acidity, but it's fruit, or it's even more than fruit. It's the complexity that we were talking about, tasting multiple different flavors at once. A good finish will have all of that as well. Okay, so let's see what you guys are saying. Lynn, thank you, Lynn. Distinct differences between Lynn's Côtes du Rhône and Gigondas. Gigondas has greater aromatic intensity. Great expression, I love that, Lynn. Aromatic intensity, how piercing, how focused the aromas are. That speaks to ripeness as well, because the fruit is more voluptuous. Greater ripeness, good. There is more alcohol. So texture in the mouth is greater as well. Yeah, alcohol adds body and texture. It can taste kind of sweet and can often give that kind of glycerol sensation, a very smooth sensation. More concentration and intensity of flavor and a longer finish in the Gigondas, everything ramped up across the board. That greater dimension invites contemplation of the following 5 points. And Lynn says finally about the Gigondas, and yes, I do want to keep on drinking, so that's a good sign. Amber with Gigal, same producer of Côtes du Rhône and Gigondas. Precision and depth is where the Gigondas stands out. So interesting that Amber is immediately going to the bottom 5 points to find a vocabulary that's appropriate for describing the better wine. Both have got similar flavors and structure, but everything is more crystalline. The flavors are more defined. in the Gigondas with a longer, more evolving finish. Great, I love that note. Really getting to the heart of what makes the wine superior. Michelle also enjoying Gigondas from Gigal. I do think, by the way, people know Gigal for making the very expensive Côte Rôtie wines, the La Mouline and the La Turque and all this, but the lower level wines are so consistently good. It's the kind of wine that if you're ever in a restaurant and you're looking at the wine list and there's not many things that leap out to you, Gigal is such a consistent bet. Lars making the point that the Côte du Rhône is a bit more jagged and feels more like a blend of different components, but the Gigondas feels more complete and put together. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, Lars, and I don't really have, that kind of language, do I? I suppose the closest thing to it would be balance, that all the elements are balanced in the Gigondas. Maybe the jagged aspect of the Côte du Rhône, maybe you're talking there about the tannins or the acidity sticking out. But I know exactly what you mean about a harmonious whole with nothing sticking out in the Gigondas. Good. Edgar commenting, the biggest difference is the Côte du Rhône has rough tannins and the alcohol feels hot. Gigondas is much more balanced, even though the alcohol levels are the same. So what's likely to balance the alcohol better? Probably more body, maybe more concentration. If you've got high alcohol, you really need a pretty good body to kind of soak that up. But yeah, sounds right. So a good example of how balance is important. Erica giving a really good example of what complexity is, complexity of flavor. Erica says more complexity in Gigondas, more earth and spice, while the Côte du Rhône is mostly candied fruit. Great, I love that. So fruit is good, but you need to layer other stuff on top of fruit for real complexity in wine. Fruit is a precondition of everything else, yes, but the most interesting wines, especially those from Europe, seem to have some kind of earthy, spicy, herbal feature, which is complexity. Tufi, Côte du Rhône and Baccarat, same producer, same alcohol, same blend. Baccarat is more aromatic with more pleasant aromas and flavors, more complex with more concentration of fruit and better balance, and a longer length and a more complex savory finish. Yeah, it's very comprehensive, isn't it? When you look down that list and you're really, ticking off everything. A good win there for the Baccarat that Tufi has. Michelle, much less concentration on the Côte du Rhône. The Gigondas is much riper with more complexity and much longer length. Good. Michelle saying the Côte du Rhône is slightly watery. Watery, I hate saying the word watery. It just feels so wrong when talking about wines, especially, these concentrated wines from the south of France, a warm climate. But I can't think of another way to explain what the opposite of concentration is. It's like when you've got a syrup concentrate and you've gone too far in diluting it. Maybe dilute is what I'm getting at. Concentrated on one hand and dilute on the other hand, maybe. And Neil comparing Côte du Rhône and Châteauneuf du Pape. Côte du Rhône is bright fruit that jumps from the glass. Châteauneuf is deeper, firmer, riper, and more serious. Good. Corey is saying the Gigondas is fruit forward with nice spice and good concentration and some pepper on the finish. So it sounds like some complexity of flavor there. Wine is complete with a long finish. Katia, the Gigondas is richer with more French oak, not mostly about the fruit. Good. So perhaps even some different winemaking going on there between the two. And Sarah, Côte du Rhône, very good for $13. Yeah, you can get great Côte du Rhône for a very small price. Gigondas is more expressive, defined aromas. A lot of you are picking up on the aromas and what I call the aromatic expression or the aromatic distinction in the better wine. I personally am someone that I don't even really need to taste a wine. I can just smell a really great wine. If you're ever lucky enough to have the first growth Bordeaux wines with 20 or 30 years bottle age, you can just smell them all day. You don't even need to taste them. The Gigondas has got softer tannins, so better tannin management in red wines. Neat concentrated fruits and a longer finish, and is overall more polished, sure. Gigondas is much more structural and therefore longer lived. So age-worthy, hitting the first point of the bottom five, age-worthy, is an appropriate category for Michel for Gigondas, not so much for Côtes du Rhône. Nupa saying the Côtes du Rhône is fresher, lighter, watery fruit, and mostly just fruit and floral, while in Gigondas the fruit is richer and denser and much more mouth-filling with layers of baking spice and savory, right? So both concentration and complexity of flavor. Good. Okay, very good. So what I want to do now is bring up a slide that we didn't look at last week, and keep those two wines in your glass. And let me just show you this slide, and let's think about this. So this is a slide which is really about wine style. Some of you were beginning to hint at it there by saying things like the Côtes du Rhône is fresh and bright and juicy, just leaps out the glass, someone said, whereas the village wine is concentrated and structured and age-worthy. Those really are style comments. So what I'm going to argue here is that we have to understand style in order to really assess quality accurately and fairly. So the way I think about what wine style is, what does wine style mean as a question, is what I've written on the second line. What is the wine trying to be? What is its identity or purpose? From a marketing perspective, you know, where you start with the person who's going to buy it, right? Another way of putting it would be, who is the target market and what would they appreciate? And then we're going to make a wine that suits that person. So I like to think about wines in this way, because to me, it gives a little bit more of a holistic perspective, rather than just sort of, I think it's extremely important to do what we just did, to break it down almost minutely into these categories, because it helps us to understand why a wine is good or not. But I think those terminologies are most relevant when put into a context of style. So in order to help you understand a little better what I mean, I've come up with 4 style sentences to try and describe wines of increasing quality, but not so much about quality as about style. So as it happens, I think as you go down this list, you're going to go up in quality, but really the wine is trying to do something different each time. So a simple everyday wine might be a wine that you can just run into the supermarket at 7:30 on a Saturday night. You're about to have dinner in 5 minutes, but you don't have anything. Just grab, you know, $10, £10, €10 off the shelf, just something which is fresh and fruity, and you can take it to your dinner party or whatever. An enjoyable wine that expresses its variety or region of origin would be something like, I don't know, like for instance, a Barbera d'Alba. Okay, you taste it and you're like, oh, Barbera, yes, I recognize this is Barbera. I enjoy it, it's pleasant. But perhaps it doesn't have any greater pretensions than that. It doesn't want to be bottle aged for another 10 years, or you know, it is what it is, and it's probably best consumed now. The next step up from that would be a wine that gives you more than just that, that makes you stop and think and offers you real pleasure, and you have to stop and think, wow, this is a really good wine, and I notice that it's good. It makes me pause for a moment. And usually those kind of wines have got some complexity as well. So I include that term in there. And then the final category here would be a sort of collectible or age-worthy wine, a fine wine that maybe would be sold on the secondary markets as well. Now, to be completely clear, these are just 4 kind of random style sentences that I wrote. There doesn't have to be 4. There could be 6. There could be 8. And they don't have to correspond with quality or price either. But in my experience, they often do. They often do. But what I want us to do now is just to think a little bit about the 2 wines that you just tasted, and where, if you had to put each wine in one of these 4 categories, let's call them A, B, C, D, which category of style would you put each wine in. Which one best fits the description of the Côtes du Rhône that you're drinking? Which one best fits the Gigondas or Châteauneuf-du-Pape that you have? We can't do this across the board because everyone's tasting different wines, of course, but it just as a kind of context. Okay, so let's start with Côtes du Rhône. Which one would you go for Côtes du Rhône? Which category best describes what you have? Okay, so Sarah is going to go with B for Côtes du Rhône, an enjoyable wine, expresses varietal origin. Tufi agrees, so does Sarah. And Erica is saying hers is in between A and B. Neil is saying B. Edgar's saying A. Lynn is saying B. Alice is saying B as well. Lars is saying B. Michelle, B. Amber is saying B. So, okay, so Côtes du Rhône, there does seem to be a general consensus that it's an enjoyable wine that expresses something. It expresses perhaps the Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre that it's made from. Perhaps it expresses that it is Côtes du Rhône, that if you've drunk enough of these wines, it is stylistically typical of that region. And now let's do the same for the Gigondas or the Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Lynn just making the point that a key for her is that the wine has got some varietal character, so that would be an enjoyable wine that expresses its variety for Côtes du Rhône. I think that's right then, great point. If you do get any sense of varietal character, then it probably can't be at the bottom level, just the kind of like jug wines or the very simplest supermarket wines that you get, which really don't taste of that much. Tufi is saying Baccarat is in C, Nupus C, Châteauneuf-du-Pape C, Michelle, Lynn, Eric are all saying C, likewise Sarah and Amber. So that sounds right to me, that by the way that you've described your wines, I'm not surprised by that outcome. I guess I would wonder whether you think that Gigondas, or especially Châteauneuf-du-Pape, could ever be a D, a really, a top category wine. I mean, Châteauneuf-du-Pape especially is held out as a type or a style of wine that is among the very best or expression of Grenache anywhere in the world, and probably the best appellation in, the south of France, Mediterranean. So what would it take, I guess, to put the wine in that final category? Or maybe you guys just think that Châteauneuf-du-Pape couldn't be in that category, which is also a possibility. Yeah, Corey making the point that Gigondas, you could be a B or you could be a C, depending on the exact wine and the producer that you have, absolutely. And Lars saying that he's caught between B and C for his Gigondas. Neil commenting the Châteauneuf-du-Pape could definitely get D, but would require bottle age, whereas Neil's example is only 2016. So that adds a further degree of complexity about the age of a wine. And that's actually something that we're going to talk about a bit next week. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to leave this slide up and I'm going to invite you to taste the third wine. So we'll go over to Italy now and we'll taste the Langhe wine. We'll leave the Barolo for just a sec. Let's just do the Langhe by itself or whatever other wine that you have, not the superior wine in this pair, just the more humble one. And think I'm going to leave this slide up so you can tell me which of the four categories you think your Langhe belongs in. But what I also want you to do is to justify the category that it's in with reference to the language from the previous slide about all those factors. So I'll leave this one up. I think you're quite familiar with this slide now. So I'll leave this one up, but if anyone wants me to go back so you can see, then just tell me and I can. So tell me which category, but justify it using the quality factors from the methodology on the previous slide. You can kind of see where I'm going with this, but I want us to start thinking in terms of connecting wine style with quality. Because I think, if we're dealing with these like a wine like Langhe Nebbiolo, for instance, same single variety as Barolo, doesn't have to, but it can come from very, very close to the Barolo region. I'm just trying to figure out for myself why there could or should or is a difference in quality and how best to interpret and understand that. And we can talk about price as well. I mean, and usually these wines are quite differently priced. Okay. Michelle saying more complexity is needed in my Gigondas to get to a D. Being able to age this wine could elevate it also. Yeah. Complexity is an interesting question that you guys are raising about the aging of the wine in bottle, which is complexity innate to a wine and you should always be able to taste it from the beginnings? Or, for instance, the development of the tertiary aromas, they are necessary to produce flavor complexity? I understand the argument from both perspectives, because you guys are saying at present the Gigondas or the Chateauneuf du Pape tastes, maybe, I'm putting words into your mouth, but I think this is what you're saying. It tastes a little bit, fruity, but I know that if it had 10 years bottle age, then it would become perhaps a bit more savory, a bit more herbal, more spicy, quite frankly, a bit more interesting. Maybe it's just a bit too much on fruit at present. And so it would achieve additional complexity with bottle age. Well, I suppose my counter argument would be something like when people like me go and taste Bordeaux en primeur every year, and you're tasting at Chateau Lafite, and you're tasting 6-month-old Chateau Lafite, and the complexity is off the charts already at that stage, and I mean it hasn't even got into the bottle yet, so it can't have any bottle age. So that would be the argument for sort of innate flavor complexity. Okay, so Sarah's saying the Langhe Nebbiolo is a B plus. Okay, Sarah, you've got to justify your answer. Michelle's saying B as well. Good aromatic expression with ripeness of fruit. Good, but lacking some complexity and concentration. Yes, very good. Balance between lively acidity and ripe red fruit with moderate intensity of flavor and a moderate finish. Yeah, so that's a great answer. Thank you, Michelle, because Michelle's, she's got a couple of moderates in there, like moderate intensity of flavor and moderate finish, maybe moderate complexity. But nonetheless, it's got a good aromatic expression and good ripeness. So perhaps just dragged down from being, already top wine just by a couple of categories, but they're very important categories. So that sort of puts you in a overall moderate state. So you probably on that basis, you could be B or C. Michelle's going B, but for instance, Sarah says B plus, and maybe that's why. Tufi is saying, he's making the other argument that he would put the Langhe Nebbiolo as a C because it has some complexity and age-worthiness. So I guess what Tufi is saying is that most of those, the points about all the different elements are all there. And in addition, it's got the age-worthiness and the complexity that sets it apart. So Tufi is getting into those bottom 5 characteristics of quality. Tufi thinks those are relevant categories for this wine. Amiel saying that the Langhe seems not to have that precise aromatic expression. Remember that in the bottom 5 categories, I was talking about precision. So Amiel is combining aromatic expression with the precision from the bottom categories, but it doesn't have that precise aromatic expression. The fruit could be less dilute. It would still be in the category B. Okay, good. Loop is saying B also. A lighter mid-palate and only a moderate finish. Okay, very good. Erica, enjoyable, and it certainly expresses the variety. I mean, I actually love Langhe Nebbiolo as a wine from most producers, excuse me, because it is so varietally expressive, isn't it? I mean, perhaps if you use too much oak or something, things get obscured, but generally speaking, you never doubt which variety you're in, right, with Langhe Nebbiolo, and that's one of the reasons I enjoy it. Erica saying ripeness, moderate intensity, moderate complexity. The finish is a bit short though. Has grippy tannins, the floral qualities and the earthiness of Nebbiolo. So clearly getting a lot of points there for typicity, which remember is one of the bottom 5 categories. So we're in that world, we're in a good wine world, but just falls a little short on the finish and perhaps on concentration. Good. Neil saying that his Langhe Nebbiolo has got a tight nose, at least at this stage, not very expressive. Between B and C, Neil making the point he wouldn't call it enjoyable. Maybe I chose the wrong wines to illustrate this with, because there's so much tannin in these wines. Perhaps enjoyable is the wrong word if they're very young, but I know what you mean, Neil. But serious, it makes you come to get it. Neil says that it's a cat and not a dog. Well, how about that? What do you think, everyone? Is Langhe Nebbiolo a cat or a dog? Lars is confident that it's a B. Varietal and regional characteristic is definitely there. The acidity and the tannin dominate the fruit. I think that's such a great comment about the dangers inherent to a single variety wine like this. That if anything goes wrong in terms of the climate in the summer that you're making the wine, the grapes are growing. If it's too hot or the tannins don't get ripe or the fruit never quite gets concentrated, then you've got nowhere to hide in a single variety wine, especially one as naked and unashamed as Nebbiolo. It's such a pure variety. So when Lars says the acidity and the tannin dominate the fruit, then those are the kind of dangers that you can have. And so in a good vintage, that purity, that naked expression can elevate the quality of the wine. In a weak vintage, it can reduce it. Whereas in other climates, you might have more safe styles that year in, year out can be attractive. I'm thinking about things like Super Tuscans, right? In a blend of Bordeaux varieties and maybe some Sangiovese, something's going to work in most years, right? And so you can just kind of change your blend accordingly. Sarah saying, Langhe Nebbiolo B+, variety expression couldn't be other than Nebbiolo, some complexity, but there is chunky tannins and a modest finish. Ambition without the polish. That's a nice phrase from Sarah. So the wine is ambitious, perhaps hasn't got the polish of the very best wines. Edgar saying that in his Langhe, hard to distinguish the individual components, although you do know that it's Nebbiolo. Great description, I love that. So perhaps lacking a bit there in the precision and detail. For Amber, clear expression of Nebbiolo aromatics, excellent balance with fine grained tannins, but needs more length and tertiary to be a D, but really an overachiever, so going with a C. So Amber's actually going with a C for her Langhe, so very good example there. Okay, good. So I think that was an interesting exercise, right? So why don't we do the same with the Barolo, compare and contrast, see whether we come to similar or different conclusions. I know in these kind of experiments, it can be a little difficult because there are so many variables. Even if you manage to find the same producer, generally speaking, it's hard to find the Langhe Nebbiolo and the Barolo of the same vintage on the shelf at the same time. So maybe it's hard to compare like and like, but anyway, do your best. It's interesting. So what I'm actually going to do, I think you know these A, B, C, D categories now. So in fact, I will go back to this slide because I suspect you may want to lean on the bottom 5 characteristics a bit more than you did with the previous wine. So let me just give you a refresher about these bottom 5 characteristics. Ageworthiness speaks for itself. Is the wine fully expressive and at the peak of its expression today, or will it improve with bottle age? Will more flavors develop, more tertiary complexity? Will the oak integrate better if there is any? Will the tannin soften? That's a big one, I think, in wines like this. Will the acidity integrate into the fruit a bit more? I mean, in a way, when we talk about ageworthiness, balance is a huge part of it. The balance between the fruit and the tannin will be preserved because the fruit might get a bit lighter, but the tannins might get a bit softer, so that's okay. But will it improve with age? Typicity, again, typicity of two things: of the variety. We've already talked, most of you, I think, agreed that your Langhe Nebbiolo couldn't have been anything other than Nebbiolo. Is the same true of the Barolo? I hope so, but I mean, that should be a given, really. Absolutely fundamental, the ability to recognize a very distinctive variety like Nebbiolo. And also, of course, typicity of place. Does it taste like it comes from? I'm going to give you Barbaresco as well. Tough to distinguish between those two, but does it taste like it comes from? Using your experience from Piedmont, from Barolo, Barbaresco, these top appellations for this variety. Typicity, again, slightly controversial, but let's say for the sake of argument that we like wines which do have typicity both of place and of variety. A third, transcending the variety. We were talking about this, very relevant in the context of Burgundy, where almost Chardonnay and Pinot Noir just seem to be vehicles for the expression of the village they come from. But I think here it's relevant as well. I mean, for instance, if you go into, one of the great producers of Barolo, you go and visit Rinaldi or Berlotto or any of those great producers, and you start talking to the winemaker and start saying, oh, after they've just poured you a $1,000 bottle of whatever single cru it is, and you start saying, oh, I love Nebbiolo because it's so juicy, it sort of misses the point, because the point of these superior wines is to tell a story beyond just the variety. Does it tell you something about the place, about the climate? Sometimes people say, oh, Barolo smells of truffles, and that kind of thing. What grows together goes together. Is there a story beyond just the variety? That's what I mean by transcending variety. Precision, detail, subtlety, we touched on a bit. I think really good wines made from any variety, including ones where you don't think it would necessarily naturally apply, will have precision and detail of their flavors. Like I was talking about blind people like me, you put it on your glasses, suddenly everything seems a lot clearer. It's a bit like that with the best wines. All the flavors come into focus, and aromas as well, as Amiel was saying earlier on. And then the beauty or the X factor that I was talking about, you just kind of stop in your tracks and think, wow, this is just really a beautiful thing. You might have the same thought about a painting or a piece of architecture or even a person, but in this case, it's a wine, and it just stops you for a sec. So those might be more relevant factors for the Barolo. But anyway, don't get too distracted. Focus on which category that you want to put the Barolo in and what your justification for doing so is. And let's see what you guys have got for me. Michelle is already breaking my careful design here by saying that she's going to put Barolo in the E category. Reminds me of the Tour de France. They have, in how steep the mountains are, they go up in the Tour de France on the bikes. They have like category 1, 2, and 3. And then they have HC, which means or category, beyond category. Typical French thing. You design a scale and then you break it. Michelle's breaking our scale already. E, great aromatic expression, true typicity with very ripe fruit, great concentration of fruit, and wonderful complexity and a long finish. Still a lot of fresh fruit, 2014 vintage. Tannins are starting to resolve, but are still very grippy. Will continue to improve for 4 to 5 years and hold for another 5 after that. Great typicity, truly Nebbiolo, beautiful wine. Despite the tannins, I could drink that without food. That's a really nice observation, the thing about being able to drink it without food, just because it's so compelling. The best wines in the world, they're irresistible. We can't stop wanting to drink them. So good. I'm glad, Michelle, that you've got a great wine. Edgar saying, here's 2016, C, but not more. You've got precision and typicity, but I question the age-worthiness given that the fruit is a bit thin and there is nothing here that transcends. Okay, good description. Erica from 2011, so a nice bit of bottle age there. Definitely a D, a thing of beauty, says Erica. As soon as it hits your nose, it's stunning, wonderful balance of fruit and maturity with enough acidity, tannin, and concentration to age a bit further. Good, just sounds like a delicious wine. 2011 was quite a warm vintage, so maybe a bit earlier maturing than, say, a cooler vintage like 2010. So maybe good to drink today, but it seems like it can still keep on improving as well. Tufi has got 2008, very age-worthy due to strong acid and tannin structure. Highly typical, lots of complexity, mixing tertiary and other flavors. Still sweet, ripe red fruit, a long length with a savory layered finish. Category D. Yeah, great description, Tufi. Particularly about the finish. Not, you know, I think somehow, whether it was Robert Parker or someone else, started timing the finishes of wine. Oh, I can taste this one for 30 seconds. I've got my stopwatch. Oh, that one's 45 seconds. You know, it's kind of dumb because they're really missing the point a little bit, that it's not just about how long it is, but how good it is. And Tufi's description makes me think about that. A long length with a savory layered finish, so a real complex finish as well as a long one. Michelle is trying to take back her category breaking E and go back down to D, but I'm not sure we should allow her. I think your first guess is your best guess, as we always say in blind tasting. Neil, 2016 Barbaresco, good balance, grippy tannins, flavors survive for a long, complex, balanced finish. Category C could become category D with development of bottle age. Corey, 2016, single crew, more of every structural component, more concentration and a longer finish, but still a C as there is not profound beauty here. Right, so, you know, it's a question at this point about how absolute you want to be about these bottom 5 categories. Even within these categories, we can talk about, you know, moderate or strong typicity, for instance. Can you still get into category D with a moderate on one of these bottom 5 categories? Corey's saying, because the beauty isn't absolute, then I'm not going to put it in category D. Maybe some of you are more generous. You still say it's a beautiful wine. It's not, you know, Chateau Lafite 1959, which I had for breakfast this morning, but it's still pretty good. So I'm going to give it a category D because I'm generous, but that's up to you. Lars, between a C and a D. To start, the Barolo has aromatic intensity that makes you want to stay with the nose for longer, layers of flavor, savory and fruity elements in balance with one another, typicity, minerality, assertive yet ripe tannins, high acidity, ripeness of fruit, combination of youthfulness, classical winemaking, long finish, and a good indication of ageability. So I guess what Lars is saying is it takes off a lot of things in category D, but still maybe not quite there. Maybe just needs a little bit more bottle age. Sarah is going with D, super pronounced but delicate aromas. I think that's the genius, isn't it, of this variety. The almost piercing intensity of the aromas, but they're also somehow ethereal and, as Sarah says, delicate. Fine tannins, high acidity, but the tannins are in balance with everything. Fresh flavors with a long finish, very defined flavors. Good. Amiel saying precision and balance in my Barolo, but I put the emphasis on transcending variety, for there is an exquisite resolution of the individual varietal aromas, secondary and tertiary ones. So good point for Amiel to bring up about whether the transcending variety thing, you find that a relevant category. I mean, as a reminder, as an overall comment, you know, this is, like I always say, wine tasting is still an art, not a science, and you don't have to tick off these like some kind of checklist. It can be helpful to do that if you don't know where to start with a wine. But sometimes factors may not be relevant. Maybe Nebbiolo is so strongly Nebbiolo in whatever guise it comes that we shouldn't even want it to transcend the variety. So you can kind of turn it on its head if that is, if that makes sense for you. Amber, C plus, I may be judging too harshly because it's young, but it's got age worthiness, typicity and precision. I love the precision, but missing the transcendence and beauty, which having more complexity from aging would likely bring in. Okay, good. And Tufi is saying beauty is in the mouth of the drinker. Yes and no. I mean, Yes, in the sense that it's very hard for me to quantify it, and you have seen me sort of desperately scrambling around to find the correct terminology to describe what I mean by beauty. But like I said last week, as someone famously applied to something else that we won't talk about today, it's hard to define, but you know when you see it. And I think that is true of everyone. That is universally true. We may apply it differently, but the idea is true for everyone. So it's just your application of it may differ, and of course that's fine. But I think the concept is still valid. Okay. Super interesting, huh? I love doing it in this context. I find all of this stuff on this slide very interesting. I think it gets particularly interesting for me, as someone who's worked in fine wine for a lot of my career, to think, especially when we get onto these bottom 5 categories. I love to think about those. Those are the kind of things that collectors get excited about, and these are the places where we find out, I think, most about the potential of a variety or the potential of a place. But really, I think it makes much more sense, though, when we put it even in a very basic style context like this, because if we have a Côtes du Rhône or a Langhe Nebbiolo, and we're sort of asking it, why isn't it a Chateauneuf-du-Pape? Why isn't it a Barolo? And therefore, it's obviously inferior or uninteresting or not worth talking about. We may be making a mistake, because we're not recognizing that we're comparing a B and a D in the terms of this slide. How appropriate in these terms is it really to compare in pure quality terms a B and a D? Remember this ultimate question I have about wine style: what's the wine trying to be? If it's only trying to be a B and it's achieving it very, very well, then should we be criticizing it for not being a D? I'm just putting that question out there, and I think that this is the real thing to focus on from today's session, that quality can be identified in absolute terms using the kind of categories that I list on the previous slide. We can go through each one and say low, moderate, high, and make an overall statement. We can do it in an absolute way. But I think it makes more sense to put that absolute assessment within a style assessment, because the question then becomes about using all those, the methodology of assessing quality. How successful is the wine within the style it's trying to be? Now, of course, when I use classic European regions of origin like this, I'm sort of making it easy for us, because like I said at the beginning, they have legally mandated requirements that affect the style of the wines that come from each region, each appellation. It would be more difficult perhaps in the New World to do this kind of tasting, where it's pretty much anything goes in most appellations. They're more about geography than they are about winemaking styles or permitted varieties. But I think here, if you could make an argument that if you have a very successful Langhe Nebbiolo being a very good B, it could be better overall, a more successful, perhaps more complete wine in its style than, say, a Barolo in category C or D that doesn't quite hit the heights for some reason. Perhaps objectively, it's got a longer finish and more concentration than the Langhe, but other factors mean that it kind of falls down in other places. So it's still, because of those two things, superior to the Langhe, objectively. But within the style constraints, maybe you would say that within the category, its own category, it's not that successful, whereas the Langhe is very successful in its category. So just kind of food for thought about sort of the universality of quality assessments. Tufi making a comment about price. Often, you know, anyone who's writing wine exams or, you know, who works in the wine business has been told in their life, don't be derogatory, don't be critical about wines that are of low price. And the reason for that is because they are fitting a certain market segment, which demands that price. And in order to hit that price point, then you have to cut certain corners in winemaking or region of origin that you're sourcing the grapes from. But it is fulfilling a purpose, the very low price wines, and probably of being a category A on this slide. So then it would be more relevant to compare category A wines to category A wines and not complain that the category A wine is not being a category B or a category C wine. So, you know, I don't really want to apply strict price categories to these 4 categories, because as I said, you could invent tons more categories. But I do think that it does make some kind of sense not to criticize a wine for being only fair or average quality, because it could actually be within that category a very good example of the style it's trying to be. So in that sense, yes, I wouldn't be derogatory about it. Let's just make a few final points, some of which I've mentioned, some of which I haven't. So the difference between our assessment, our discussion about Burgundy last time, and the discussion today, I was thinking about it, and I would argue that what we saw in Burgundy wasn't really so much a change of style. That stylistically, yes, the better wines clearly are more age-worthy and things like that. But we saw what I would call an intensification of the wine's characteristics or facets. That everything just incrementally at every level, intensity, complexity, just seems to increase just a little bit. But someone was saying that in their wine, they didn't just have Nebbiolo, they also had Barbera. And that brings up the point that you can actually not just increase the quality, but you can also change the style of the wine. And I think style is relevant when it comes to the Langhe kind of Barolo conversation, because we're thinking about wines that really serve different purposes. One style is for immediate consumption, may improve for a little bit, but not for that long, whereas the other one may be a 20-year wine. So those factors are all relevant to Burgundy, of course, but there's a freedom as well within these different regions to make a bit of a different style as well. Not just in terms of hitting those price points, but if you compare Côtes du Rhône, juicy, balanced, but rich table wine with Gigondas or Châteauneuf-du-Pape, you know, different purposes, slightly different styles as well. So just be open to the thought that when you're assessing different quality, that style is really a key element. And I think we've done well identifying that today. And like I said, how appropriate is it to compare wines of different styles? Philosophically, what's the basis for assessing quality? How much commonality of style do you have to have before you can start comparing wines? This is a relevant question for professional wine buyers choosing wines for a restaurant or a retail store, but also, frankly, for the consumer. They might buy a Langhe for a Tuesday night, but a Barolo for a Saturday night, with an expectation of the style they're going to find within the bottle. Now, just a few qualifications I guess we should point out, which we haven't really mentioned so far today, which is that, of course, some winemakers in Europe do break these categories, and you've always got to be aware of that. For instance, I don't know, talking about Côtes du Rhône, Chateau Reyas, maybe the great producer of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, have a Côtes du Rhône project called Fonsalette, another one called Détour. And these are incredible wines, which quite frankly break their categories. We talked about this a little bit with that one Burgundy producer I was mentioning last week, Madame Leroy, where the appellation system seems to break down when you're in the presence of someone who can make just great wines from apparently humble terroirs. So don't always take the appellation, terroir, geographical differences thing as complete gospel, because I've seen some winemakers kind of manage to transcend it. You know, a classic example of this is in Tuscany, you know, in the Super Tuscans, where in the 60s, 70s, 80s, people started making wines in a totally unrecognized place, where the conventional appellation system would say, you know, there's no quality to be found here. You can't do it, but they did. And so they used this IGT category. And those things point up, when that happens, when you have a Vin de France for $100, those are the wines which tell us that sometimes that conventional appellation system just isn't working as well as it could or as well as it should. The flip side of that, though, is I would be cautious if I'm a winemaker about using those appellations. There's still a lot of strength in the traditional appellations in Europe. People do know the famous brand names. If you have got a Ravera Cru in Barolo, I think it would be very ill-advised to declassify it to being Langhe Nebbiolo, because you wouldn't be able to mention the Cru on the label, and it would be very hard to tell a story that would convince people to get the price that you want for that wine. So, you know, just be a little cautious, I guess, in that situation. One of the big reasons, we didn't really talk about it today, but you can declassify from Barolo to Langhe or from Gigondas to Côtes du Rhône for whatever reason you like. A lot of winemakers do it because, you know, they think the vines are not old enough, they're not making good enough quality fruit. But the more usual reason is that in good, ripe, successful vintages, they just have a lot of fruit. They have too much yield, and the yields in the prestigious appellations are low. So what are they going to do with the excess fruit that they have? They declassify it to the lower appellation. And maybe when they do that, if you think about it, they might have to rein off a little bit on the winemaking. Maybe they do a little less extraction for that fruit, even though it comes from the same vineyard as the 25-year plus aging potential Barolo. But maybe for that one, they say we're going to do less extraction. We need less tannin in this wine because people are going to drink it, you know, more readily. And I've mentioned in these sessions before my frustration with when you encounter a wine. The Langhe region would be a great example, where you encounter a wine that by the label and by the price should be ready to drink immediately when you buy it, but it's nowhere near. It's very frustrating because the label has given you an apparent promise of one thing, but you're getting something else. And I think you have to be a little cautious about that if you're a winemaker. You do not want to upset your consumers. So yeah, the premium appellations are worth a lot of money on a wine label, and they do need to be able to taste like that as well. Okay, any final questions about all that? I think we've done a really good job in the last two sessions, Burgundy and this session, in creating a methodology, a sort of abstract methodology for tasting quality in a wine and how to assess raw quality. But I'm really pleased to layer on top of that this sense of style, that until you know what style of wine is aiming for, until you really understand what a wine's identity or purpose is, then any quality assessment feels a little bit kind of abstract, and it's always a very relevant part of the conversation. So next week we will go on to a different aspect of winemaking, which you guys were talking about today, about the effects of age on a wine. Super interesting conversation. How can we discuss this in terms of quality? So I think that's going to add another layer of complexity to our discussions about quality. So I look forward to that discussion, and I will see you same time next week. Thank you, guys.